We have amongst us Mr. Anirudh Arun, co-founder, CEO, Blue Smart. Ladies and gentlemen, he'll be talking on how startups can disrupt industries that's dominated by giants. So it's David versus Goliath. Can we have you, sir?
Hi, very good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be amongst, so many passionate marketers in this room and talking about something that's really close to us, about disruption, right? I mean, disruption is a word that's often thrown about very lightly, but it means a very specific thing. It's about actually innovating. It's about changing the mindset of customers. Often it's about understanding gaps in services and then addressing those gaps, fulfilling it, and basically capturing market share, expanding the market. There are a bunch of things that we can do as product and marketing guys. Wherein and disruption is actually a way in which progress is brought about in various industries. So here today, what I'm going to talk about is dueling with giants. It's about how the little guys, basically the startups, can actually compete in large markets which are completely dominated by behemoths. This could be large OTT players, it could be large banks, it could be large mobility players, it could be large FMCG brands. But how do startups with much fewer resources, much less capital, much fewer people, how do they think about these problems strategically? How do they disrupt these value curves, and how do they capture market share? How do they change the way the game is played, right? So so today's discussion will specifically focus on Blue Smart's journey, and I'm not sure how many of you, and I'm sure a few of you would have and I'm hoping that few of you would have definitely tried Blue Smart, but it's very closely linked to how Blue Smart has gone about creating for itself a space in the mobility market, however nascent and new it might be, but it's certainly a fast growing market, and it's about how Blue Smart entered this space, which is dominated by two large players, right? So I'd like to start with a quick backstory, right? The overall mobility market in India was went through multiple stages over the last past one and a half decades, right? So when we're talking about say around 2019, when actually Blue Smart started, we were actually seeing the end of the rapidly growing market size that of the cab market size that was happening. So there was some level of plateauing that was happening in terms of the absolute market size of the cab industry, and what we were also seeing simultaneously, and it's possibly causation and correlation both, that the large players in the industry, they started focusing more on profitability. They started looking to IPO, and there were a lot of economic pressures on them as well to not just grow at all costs, but also be economically more responsible and fiscally frugal. And I think what I'm trying to capture in this slide is the 2019 scenario in which Blue Smart actually entered the mobility market, wherein we the question was, is this an opportunity? The growth in this fast-growing organized cab industry is actually slowing down a bit, although the market penetration of cabs in India is still very, very low compared to global standards. And India is continuing to economically progress. Our GDP per capita is increasing, so there is going to be increased penetration. But probably the the low-hanging fruits have been quickly picked, and now the big players are now focusing more on profitability and not just growth at all costs. So at that point, the question was, is this an opportunity for a new player to enter the market? Is there really a place where a new player like Blue Smart could think about entering this mobility space? And we heard a lot of no's, and that's why it's a it's a non-consensus space. If we had heard a lot of yeses, then I would assume that there would be a bunch of other Blue Smarts as well, right? The entire consensus was definitely against the concept of a third player entering this kind of a space. And I'm actually showcasing a couple of news articles back from 2018, 2019, wherein, we could actually see, people talking about a speed bump where Uber and Ola were facing a slight slowdown in terms of the number of, rides and the total value that, the revenue that they were bringing in. And Uber and Ola also at that time was starting to talk about IPO and so on and so forth. In that backdrop, that's where BlueSmart was actually entering the picture. Now the question is, when you had heavily entrenched players, and I'm sure that many of us had both the apps on our phones, was there really a space for someone else to actually come in and even have the right to even take away a single ride from two well-established players with very deep-pocketed players, right? So here, what I would like to actually take you through is actually an excerpt from a recent Forbes India article about BlueSmart, wherein it talks about, and what I've highlighted is basically, it talks about a lot of investors who actually rejected BlueSmart upfront at that point, saying that, hey, there is no scope for a third player. There are very deeply entrenched giants in the industry. And the industry is a duopoly or a monopoly. I mean, this analogy could be extended to various other segments, right? You could talk about how Hotstar and Sony Live and Netflix are probably entrenched in the OTT space, and then you have a Jio Cinema. Of course, there the story is very different because it's a very deep-pocketed parent company that's actually bringing it in. But actually, how are you disrupting an industry that's already having very dominant, well-entrenched players, right? And and I'm going to read out the highlighted portion here. It was nothing less than daredevilry to take on the might of Ola and Uber in the ride-hailing business. अरे तुम्हें पता भी है तुम क्या कर रहे हो? Do you guys even know what you're up to? Was the clutch of well-wishers, was how the clutch of well-wishers expressed their concern. So this is what a lot of naysayers, and these were genuine, rational people who were probably well-wishers as well, who talked about why are you entering this industry? There are a lot of other spaces where you can enter. How are you going to enter here? So what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides is actually about how a startup can actually enter a space which appears to be completely saturated, probably a red ocean wherein people are entering into price wars, and doesn't look like an opportunity to create a niche for yourself. How do you enter that space, and how do you actually fashion out a market for yourself? How do you bring these evangelists, these consumers who are sticky consumers who really love your brand? So, but before we do that, we need to understand that the players here who are being referred to as the giants, they were themselves disruptors in an earlier avatar. So all of us will, remember what happened if we rewind further to, the 2010 to 2015 period, wherein Ola and Uber launched at a time when radio taxis were attempting to organize the market. So earlier we had only, the completely unorganized market. And then you had the easy cabs, the fast track, then the mega and the Meru cabs kind of radio taxis that came in. And you can see here that, all of these guys were operating, close to maybe around 10-15,000 taxis at one point. This was around, 2014, 2015, which is when the, Ola and Uber came into India and launched their India arm, and Ola also came in to challenge them, and the two players came in with app-based mobility, which was a very cool thing back then. I remember that a lot of us downloaded these apps just to ride the luxury cars, because that was a very unique way to enter a market. I mean, again, something that CMOs would have, it's a CMO's dream, right, to enter a market in a very unique fashion. Although that's not your core product, you're just bringing that oomph in to convert consumers, giving them the first taste of a brand, right? So we need to understand that these players were disruptors of their own in an earlier avatar, and it just goes to say that disruption is not in the DNA of a particular company or a particular sector. It's something that is possible by anyone, right? And the disruptive step is what is more important than a particular company that disrupts or a particular category that disrupts. So electric mobility itself is disrupting the internal combustion engine market, but this disruption, it could further be disrupted by some other technology down the line. I mean, in 2040 we might be talking about something else that has disrupted the market. So what we are really interested in this in this short discussion is how the disruptive step itself is valuable and how that helps create a market. So we can talk, we are looking, I just wanted to take, give you a throwback to the 2010 to 2015 period, wherein, people were talking about with excitement how these new startups had actually raised their initial bits of capital, and, they launched their luxury segment, and how they drove into India and so on and so forth. Now, fast forward another 4 years back to 2019, where we initially started in the first flashback, we see that, I'm sorry, the slide is, I think, lost its fonts, but I'll walk you through it. I should have probably used a PDF instead of a PPT, so that's unfortunate. But I think what we're talking about is that in 2019, when what happened with these industries, with the industry, is that the scenario completely changed from what 2015 was, right? These companies were again focusing on profitability at that point. The market growth had, the growth curve was not that steep. The early adopters had already started using, the early majorities had also come in. The market, had the majority consumers, people who were even probably the laggards who were installing the apps on their phones. And at this point, people started having an expectation from the mobility as a category, right? And they realized that the incumbent brands now, the big guys, now the startups which had now become the big guys, were not probably fulfilling these needs in in the way that they wanted. So there were, frequent cancellations, surge pricing was, completely uncontrolled. You had like 2x, 3x kind of surge pricing often. Cabs were probably not of the, greatest quality. I mean, a lot of those initial cabs that came in 2015, they'd become very old, and people hadn't maintained them in a way that, consumers would like. Driver partners were extremely stressed. The initial earnings that the driver partners were getting. So again, as a platform, you need to look at it not only from a consumer's lens, you also need to look at it from, the supply side, right? Which is basically the driver partners that are providing the service. So if the supply side is not happy, then effectively you're not going to be able to deliver, great service. So there were on all sides you were seeing pressures that were coming into these platforms, and that is the key insight that probably BlueSmart was able to figure out in the early days. So while BlueSmart is known for electric mobility, the key insights were that the driver partner was stressed, the vehicles were getting old, the vehicles were not kept up in a very clean and tidy kind of way. Surge pricing was massive, ride denials, ride cancellations were, becoming rampant. And these were all, various gaps that were identified. And this is where BlueSmart decided that, hey, as a startup without, billions of dollars in funding, can we enter the market in a unique way and capture the minds of these consumers, both from the rider side as well as the driver partner side, and, create a unique product offering? Can we reinvent this value curve that is being given to consumers and actually capture, the market? And I think that's where BlueSmart came in and said that, hey, the customer expectation is here, but the service delivery is here, and this is the big gap that we are able to identify. That's people are not talking about yet, but maybe if we position our service here, then we will enable people to start talking about it, right? So BlueSmart came up with a zero denial, zero surge pricing customer service for customers with zero emission cabs, and there was zero financial burdens on customers, right? On drivers. So the drivers didn't have to own the cars anymore. BlueSmart created an innovative financial model wherein driver partners would just come and drive the cars. They don't need to own the assets and, pay back the EMIs and feel financially stressed when banks send collectors to, collect their loans, especially exacerbated by the COVID-19 situation, right? And these were positioned as a more premium category of cabs because, again, the consumer who was looking at environmental friendly options was also the urban consumer who was looking at, a slightly more elevated kind of service. They were at least the innovator category of customers were actually people who were, looking for a better brand, better service, and these sedans and these SUVs that BlueSmart came in with really ticked off some of those boxes, both in Delhi NCR and in Bangalore, now that I can talk about two cities, right? And what electric mobility also does from a financial perspective is that it helps you run at a much lower cost, especially when petrol and diesel prices are soaring. Electricity costs are, capped, and that actually helps in bringing much lower operating costs of these vehicles, and this actually helps the company go into more positive unit economics. So on the back of all of this, BlueSmart was able to create a very differentiated value curve for customers, and this is probably the key to understanding the disruption in the market, right? So what the category of giants actually looked at was, they looked at being asset light and they looked to maximize availability of cabs. So if you look at a category of Ola and Uber and the large ride aggregation aggregators, what they did is their focus was on maximizing availability. They said that 5 minutes may you'll get a cab, like you don't need to think about booking a cab. Just book a cab and the cab will come to you. The cab will move on an app and you can track your cab and so on and so forth, right? And the other thing they said is that we are an asset light platform, and we are only a tech platform, and both the customers and the supply side are independent third parties, and we are only connecting them, right? And then you had to contrast that, what they had disrupted initially was actually the traditional local taxi company industry, right? Wherein the availability was much lower. You had to phone up someone and ask them to send a car, etc., etc. So that was a very difficult industry to enter with. And the asset lightness of that was not there. Everyone owned their own cars, right? They owned their cars and they were operating. And similarly, you can see that, the Ola and Uber and the cab aggregator industry made the service regions very vast. So whether you are in Delhi NCR or in Bangalore or in Kolkata or a tier 2 kind of a city as well, Lucknow, Kanpur or a Jaipur, it's very easy that you could get an app based taxi, right, which was more difficult in the earlier days. So that is the disruption that they had brought in. What BlueSmart said at this point is that, hey, we are not going to compete in availability and asset lightness as much as the large players and maybe the service regions. Let us compromise on a few things, because we don't have the deep pockets that some of these aggregators have. In the early days, we will have to compromise on a few things, like we don't have the number of cabs that we don't have a 1 lakh cabs, right? We probably started with 1,000 cabs or 500 cabs. How do you start with that kind of? How do 500 cabs go up against 1 lakh cabs, right? I mean, you can't match the availability, you can't match the instantness, right? But what we said is we will match the pricing, or probably even keep a slightly higher pricing. But what we will not err on is driver training, car quality, reliability, right? We said that these are zero cancellation cabs, these are zero emission cabs, these are zero surge pricing cabs. So we will give you reliability in all forms, we will give you car quality in all forms, and we will make unit economics better. And we added that unique flavor of environmental friendliness, right? Which is becoming more and more important for customers. Back in 2019, people were really asking, are people really going to choose a brand just because it's an electric cab? At that point, we had a gut feel that yes, there are, at least those early environmentally conscious users who think about the environment a lot, but consensus was out. But today we can tell you, for a fact that a lot of consumers are, thinking about being ethically responsible, environmentally responsible consumers, sustainable consumers, and that sort of market. So you can see that the value curve that BlueSmart created for customers was very different from the value curve that the previous giants had created, which is what created the gap, right? Which is why a lot of consumers started leaving some of the original brands that they were so sticky users of, and they gave another chance to a new brand, right? And then you need to continuously follow up with your service delivery and actually meet the promises. So that's how you actually, probably create a playbook for disrupting an industry with limited resources, right? And innovation doesn't end with just one disruptive step, as we have seen. I mean, the disruptor can get disrupted if you don't constantly innovate. And which is why BlueSmart continues to innovate in, a bunch of things, bringing in better unit economics, cross-selling and upselling different, products that make the lives of customers better and easier. For example, we have a recurring rides product, which basically says that every day morning at 8:30, if you want a car, you don't need to book a car every day morning. You can just set it up once, and every day morning the car will come to your house. You don't need to look at your phone. it's like the good old days when the school bus used to come, right? And pick up pick up kids from school, and it still happens to whoever has school going children. So every day at 8:30 the car will come or the bus will come, and that's something that BlueSmart does, right? It's just a cab service. Only thing, we're able to understand that consumer's pain point and actually fulfill it before the consumer actually comes out and says that, hey, this is a point that breaks for me, right? And there are a bunch of things on the EV charging side that we are monetizing, etc., etc. And there's so much of innovation that is happening constantly, and I think that is one of the important tenets of continuously staying ahead of the curve. I think with that, I'd love to I hope I've been able to convey some ideas on how to enter a new industry and capture market share. Thank you so much.